Good evening, Erev Tov. Tonight we gather as a community of those who have come together to express our love and admiration of Edgar M. Bronfman. Son, grandson, brother, father, grandfather, great-grandfather, husband, fierce friend and advocate for the Jewish people wherever they lived, defender of freedom and justice, insistent prophet of learning, of doing, of joy. Ner Hashem Nishmat Adam, the spirit of man, of this man, of Edgar, is the light of the eternal, and this candle burns bright for Edgar, Yechiel, in whose name and memory eternality abides. Around the throne of this king, this man, this father, husband, brother, son, are the wrought and rendered works of life so fully lived: achievement, generosity, justice, redeemed captives and revitalized youth, learning with questions and heresies leading to knowledge, to morality, and no shortage of jokes. Thank God for the jokes. Tonight there is hallowed memory and laughter. There are tears of sadness and longing and awestruck recognition over just how much one man can achieve. With raw humility, goodness, and kindness, his family laid his body to rest 1 month ago. And tonight, as Edgar insisted, we join together as one to remember him with joy, to celebrate the life of Edgar M. Bronfman. Zecher Tzadik Livracha, may his memory always be a blessing.
On behalf of the children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, siblings, nieces, nephews, and extended family of Edgar Bronfman, I'd like to welcome you all to this memorial tribute. From his friends in New York, Sun Valley, and Virginia, to his valued business associates at Seagram, from his fellow statesmen, American, Canadian, Israeli dignitaries, to his fellow leaders in the world of Jewish philanthropy. From the Bronfman Youth Fellowships, NYU Bronfman Center, and Hillel students and leadership here in person and in many Hillel campuses joining via live stream. The turnout is overwhelming, and we are very, very grateful. I'd like to begin by honoring a very special person who, in a truly wonderful way, loved Dad thoroughly for the past 25 plus years. Of course, I'm talking about his amazing wife, Jan Aronson. Jan, thank you for giving Dad the gift of your love, for your incredible caring, and for your sense of humor. You enriched Dad's life immeasurably, in sickness and in health. I am forever grateful. Edgar M. Bronfman lived a remarkable life. Much of it you know about. But let me touch on a few things you may not know. Dad loved crossword puzzles, fine wine, and giving people nicknames. Mighty Bum, Love Bug, Haldol, Taxi, And Bear, you know who you are. As kids, we spent hours throwing the baseball around the backyard. We went to New York Giants football games in the old Yankee Stadium. And on Sunday nights, we were in front of the TV watching shows like Bonanza. In fact, it was another TV favorite, Hogan's Heroes, that inspired Dad's endearing and iconic nickname, Tree. Dad's tree was his favorite red leather chair at our home. Naturally, when he wasn't in the room, we all scrambled to sit in it. And when he came in, he'd say in his best Colonel Klink voice, "Get out of my tree." This name stuck, and as you can imagine, it came to mean more than a piece of furniture. That term of affection symbolized his character, his strength, his compassion, and his wisdom. Dad was a true tree of knowledge. He had a lifetime love of learning. He wrote 6 books. He took piano lessons in his 70s and 80s. He studied the Talmud, and he watched Jeopardy religiously. For many years, I looked for a painting or a photograph of a tree to give Dad. I could never find the right one. Finally, my wife Kelly and I found the photograph, and it arrived in Dad's and Jan's apartment early in his last week. He loved it and had it right in front of his chair there in his library, where he spent many of his last hours. More important to me was that despite his health, he made the effort to call us and give us a cheerful thank you. Family mattered so much to Dad. He had lots of families beyond his biological one. His Seagram colleagues, to a person, extol the culture that Dad created at Seagram, where each person felt they were part of Dad's extended family. Working at Seagram gave me the opportunity to work with Dad. After 15 years or so at the company, in a variety of roles, mostly in the wine business, Dad asked me to join the corporation's board of directors. Of course, I accepted. In welcoming me to the board, Dad reminded me I had one of 2 votes, either I or I resign. For his entire life, he had the courage of his convictions. He followed his instincts and intuitively knew the path to take and did so without fear. But there was an incident nearly 40 years ago now that bonded Dad and me in a deep and meaningful way. After I was kidnapped and held for ransom, the kidnappers insisted the ransom be paid in person by Dad. Law enforcement officials strongly advised against doing so, citing his great personal risk. But Dad said no. He'd lived a great life, and if need be, that it was now my turn. Dad was 46. He delivered the ransom. That demonstrated pure courage. Thank you, Dad. Edgar M. Bronfman. He was a man to look up to, a man to respect and to emulate. I miss him greatly, and I always will. Rest in peace, Dad. I love you.
Being Jewish to me means I'm a member of a family that goes back to Abraham. Being Jewish to me means I have certain ethics that I follow. Being Jewish to me means that there are certain precepts that I believe in, like tikkun olam, and being God's partner in creation. I think that the most important thing we can do is through education. We have to understand that we have to love our neighbors as ourselves. You can't be proud in a vacuum. You have to know what you're proud of. Therefore, knowledge is terribly important.
I was 10 years old when the war started, 1939 in Canada. Mm-hmm. I got so excited about the creation of the state and so wildly proud of Israel during the Six-Day War, so that we all felt that, you know, that it was fantastic, that we were all Jews together.
Oh, I'm for peace. I think for peace is absolutely the most vital thing. Peace with honor, peace with dignity, peace with security. The World Jewish Congress was the only international Jewish organization that had all the Eastern European countries, with the exception of the Soviet Union, as members, and that we could perhaps do something to get the Jews out of the Soviet Union. Because all my grandparents came from that country, I felt I owed their memory something.
The issue really has never been money, as far as I'm concerned. The twin things that I sort of really work on is justice and the truth. I want to find the truth of what happened during this whole period from 33 on into the 40s. And I want to find justice for those who perished or those whose relatives have some money that was put there.
But I enjoy helping people. It fills my life. Making money is wonderful, and building a business is wonderful. But going beyond that, there has to be something. I'm very proud to have started this. I'm even prouder that I had the intelligence to keep my hands off it and let the professionals do a really wonderful job.
My message is that it's wonderful to be Jewish. It's wonderful to know who you are.
I wrote about my father in our annual report that he made the place better than he found it. And if my children can say that about me, that's enough.
Good evening. I'm Jeremy Bronfman, one of Edgar's 24 proud grandchildren. If every one of us spoke on this stage today, the Philharmonic would have to cancel its next concert, and maybe the whole season. So I'm especially proud to tell you a little bit about the man that we so affectionately called Tree. I polled my siblings and cousins for reflections, and a few common themes emerged. First, the idea that Tree somehow knew when he was needed and when he could make a big difference in our lives by sharing his love and support. For me, that was Chili Night, a weekly dinner that he and Jan started when I was 15 years old. On those occasions, he would always lend a sympathetic ear, tell a great story, or even better, share one of his legendary dirty limericks. Another common memory of Tree was how he built a strong family community by creating forums for his children and grandchildren, not only to share time with him, but to get to know each other. We bonded as a family, and a lot of that came from laughing about, telling stories about our loving grandfather. Tree set a shining example by always striving to do the right thing, even when that was highly controversial. But his audacity was mixed with real humility, especially in his later years. At Shiva for Tree, Rabbi Zion shared a really fitting parable from the Talmud. It goes like this. A man was traveling through the desert, hungry, thirsty, and tired. He came upon a tree bearing sweet fruit and affording plenty of shade. underneath which ran a spring of water. He ate of the fruit, drank of the water, and sat beneath the shade. When he was about to leave, he turned to the tree and said, "Tree, O tree, with what shall I bless you? Should I bless you that your fruit be sweet? Your fruit is already sweet. Should I bless you that your shade be plentiful? Your shade is plentiful. Should I bless you that a spring of water run beneath you? A spring runs beneath you already. There is one thing with which I can bless you. May it be that all of the trees planted from your seeds should be like you." I don't think that Edgar's 24 grandchildren could imagine a greater blessing than to be like him. Thank you.
The first time I had lunch with Edgar, I told him how we can resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I was 16 years old. I had just completed the Bronfman Youth Fellowship summer program in Israel, and he'd asked me to join him for a private lunch in the dining room on the 5th floor of the Seagram building. With the earnestness and clarity of a 16-year-old, I gave him my prescription for Mideast peace. Edgar didn't crack a smile. He didn't condescend. He leaned in and said, "I had the exact same discussion with Prime Minister Shamir last week." As a Bronfman Fellow, I knew that Edgar's program took young people seriously. We were introduced to high-level text, big ideas, accomplished leaders. What I didn't know was that Edgar the man took young people seriously as well. That day, I learned that his investment in us as teenagers was a reflection of his pragmatic belief that anyone can change the world. 13 years later, I was an attorney living in Israel, and Edgar invited me to lunch again, this time to discuss running his foundation. I flew back to New York and met him in the same private dining room. We had a very similar conversation about politics, values, the future of the Jewish people. And at the end of the lunch, Edgar told me that I would be running his foundation. See you in September. And this would be the second time that Edgar made an investment in me based on my potential and not on my record. Working alongside Edgar, I saw a man who embodied the values of his foundation. He believed in the power of Jewish education as a path to Jewish Renaissance. He believed in the importance of an inclusive and welcoming Jewish society. And he always valued the development of young leaders because he knew that they had not lost the ability to see the world as it ought to be. The last lunch I shared with Edgar was just a few days before his death. It was our staff lunch at the Four Seasons, and Edgar, surrounded by the professionals who drive his mission, thanked us each for believing in his vision. And he said, "We're really making an impact." The impact of Edgar Bronfman will be felt for generations to come, whether it was through his championing of the Bronfman Fellows, Hillel, My Jewish Learning. Edgar taught me that a philanthropist is someone who does, not just someone who funds. I will always cherish those lunches with Edgar. because they left me with a greater appetite. On a very personal level, Edgar showed me how to strive and create something for those who come after you. And to me, that is living legacy. Thank you, Edgar.
Each of us here today, and so many others around the world, had their own personal relationship with my father. But I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about Edgar, the Jewish leader. As many of you know, Dad had issues with the notion of God. He simply didn't believe in him. You see, Dad's orientation to Judaism and life was his belief in our collective obligation to act in a godly fashion. That is, to take the attributes that we see in God and act on them in the treatment of others. He carried himself with a sense of dignity that earned him a position of unparalleled strength. When he conducted his interreligious work, he was once graciously told by a Vatican official that the Church advanced the doctrine of tolerance towards the Jewish people. My father retorted, "I don't want your tolerance. You can keep it. I want your respect." Dad accorded respect to others and expected others to grant the Jewish people the same. My father was blessed with charm, good looks, piercing blue eyes, a fabulous sense of humor, a voracious appetite to learn, and the dual platforms of Seagram and the World Jewish Congress. But what makes him a legendary Jewish leader was that he used all of those resources and his fundamental core values of moral justice to work for a better, a safer, and a more just world for Jews and non-Jews alike. I had the great privilege of traveling with my father on some of his World Jewish Congress business. No matter whom we met, whatever the country or the issue, Tree always had one theme front and center: moral justice. In 1985, my father found himself sitting in his office at the Seagram building, confronted with startling information. The former United Nations General Secretary and then candidate for presidency of Austria, Kurt Waldheim, was a former Nazi officer. My father was advised that disclosing this information in the midst of the Austrian presidential campaign would be met with widespread public disapproval. It could be seen as foreign interference in the domestic politics of a sovereign nation. He heard the advice, and he listened to his conscience. "This is not a political issue," he said. "This is a moral issue." For Dad, Kurt Waldheim was a war criminal, responsible for the deaths of thousands. And the question for him was not whether he should do something, but how dare he not. And thanks to Dad's efforts, Waldheim was declared persona non grata in capitals around the world. And the United States Justice Department put him on its watch list, effectively indicting him and keeping him from entering this country. I saw my father nervous exactly once in my life. It was 1990, and we were in Moscow together. For the previous 5 years, my father had been meeting with senior government officials from all over Europe and the USSR, building his credibility with the Soviet government, his expertise and intricacies of the issues at hand, and advancing his diplomatic skills. His unique ability to charm with his smile and lighten a room with his humor, to impress with his intellect, and his passionate articulation of the moral issues facing the Soviets earned him a meeting at the very top, culminating that day. And after breakfast on that gray, cold morning 24 years ago, my father could not find the tie he wanted to wear. So there I stood in our hotel suite as the four-letter words ricocheted off the walls. And I imagine that our KGB handlers were well enough versed in the finer aspects of the English language to have been quite amused. It was not long before I located his tie and suggested to Tree that he take a few deep breaths and gather his thoughts before he headed over to the Kremlin to meet with President Gorbachev. After the formal introductions and pleasantries, President Gorbachev began talking and talking and talking. And in the middle of President Gorbachev's monologue, my father raised his hand slightly and interrupted. A stunned Gorbachev became red in the face and stopped speaking. Ambassador Dobrynin's eyes nearly popped out of his head. And my father said coolly, "Mr. President, I know you are incredibly busy and have very limited time. And if it is okay with you, can we please discuss the issues you invited me here to discuss?" It's hard to imagine the guts it took for him to interrupt the one man who held in his hands the fate of millions of Soviet Jews. But in that moment, with the raising of his hand, with the tone of his voice, and with his favorite tie, he won Gorbachev's respect and admiration. And the rest, as they say, is history. But Tree did not just make history, he sought to correct it as well. In the mid-1990s, he became convinced that the Swiss banks had profited from the Jewish assets deposited before and during the Holocaust. In September 1995, my father led a delegation of Jews to meet the Swiss Banking Association in Bern. In a meeting made famous by my dad's recounting of the incredulous events, the head of the banking authority explained that previous audits had found all of 739 dormant accounts with a total value of $5.6 million. My father took that as a stinging symbol of the Swiss bankers' arrogance and characteristic of their efforts to dismiss the Jewish calls for moral justice as a petty nuisance. Worse, he believed that the Swiss thought that the Holocaust survivors could just be bought off. But for my father, as you heard in the video, it was never about the money. It was about providing a small measure of justice for Holocaust victims. It was about correcting the record of history. Several weeks later, in his Manhattan apartment, my father approached one of his dinner guests and asked that she help his efforts to expose the Swiss banks and bring about justice. And the guest asked if they had a chance of gaining such justice. And my father replied, "With your husband's help, yes." And the very next day, my father stood in the Oval Office and made his case to President William Jefferson Clinton. The campaign against the Swiss banks was not easy. It was long, it was bitter, but ultimately the power of moral justice prevailed, and over $1.2 billion was granted to the victims. One of our great sages, Ben Zoma, famously asked, "Who is wealthy?" And he answers, "He who is happy with what he has." Yes, Dad was born into privilege, and his business acumen made him even wealthier. However, he saw giving back to the world as his most important activity, and it resulted in decades of full-time, incredible leadership in diverse areas, advancing the interests of the Jewish people and the world at large. And for this, as you know, President Clinton awarded my father the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1999, saying, quote, "For his steadfast devotion to others, Edgar Bronfman has earned our nation's deep gratitude." Dad's greatest strength, and perhaps his most important legacy to his children, his grandchildren, and all who celebrate him here, was expressed to me by one of our generation's great Jewish scholars, Rabbi Adin Steinsaltz. He told me that my father was a shining example for Jews, not because he gave away money or because he toiled for the betterment of our people, as there are so many others that do that as well. What made Edgar Bronfman unique is that at the age of 50, when he became head of the World Jewish Congress, he knew very little Jewishly. But he took the time to study, and through his learning, he was able to develop his moral core and sense of Jewish values which guided him. At an age when most people rest on their laurels, he began his career as a Jewish statesman and never stopped learning. As a result, he became the leader that he could never have become otherwise. Dad often said, and you heard this in the video also, that it is our job to leave this world a better place than we found it. Tree, you did your job well. And now it is left to us to do our job. His was a life exceptionally well lived. May his memory be a blessing and an inspiration to us all.
Edgar came from the lions, fearless, hopeful, a born leader. Yet, he was a man of deep convictions, never reluctant to face the truth. He was a leader of our people and a spokesman for our justice. He wasn't afraid to argue with non-Jewish people, but also he wasn't afraid to argue with the Jews as well. He went from country to country, from leader to leader, to tell them that they have to fight anti-Semitism, to tell them the suffering of the Jewish people, straight and direct and respected. As you know, he was a charismatic person, tall, with blue eyes, impatient to nonsense, but always devoted to the point. We shall miss him as a great person, as a strong Jewish leader, that his real wealth was not necessarily money, but service to his people. Will God bless his memory.
What an extraordinary tribute and celebration this has been, to hear from so many heartfelt words about Edgar and his family and his service, to hear the wisdom and compassion of Shimon Peres. I am honored and privileged to join with Jan, with Edgar's children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, and the entire Bronfman family, and so many friends from around the world, as we say farewell to a champion for justice and human dignity, a loving and generous spirit, and a dear friend. My family has been fortunate to share in Edgar's warmth and affection for many years. Bill and I got to know him, spend time with him, and work with him. And we will always be grateful for the friendship that he and Jan forged with Chelsea and Mark. They showed our daughter and son-in-law special kindness and supported their marriage and their future together. He was a man who understood faith, and he had faith first and foremost in his Jewish faith, but he also recognized and appreciated those who had faith as well, who could bring their blessings and gifts to work on behalf of the better world that Edgar sought. One of the first times I had a chance to spend time with Edgar was back in the early 1990s. We were seated next to each other at a dinner, and at one point in the evening, he leaned over and whispered a joke in my ear. It was, as the audience reaction understands, a very Edgar joke. All these years later, I well remember it. I just can't repeat it. But I laughed until my sides hurt, and he took great pleasure in watching everyone watching me, wondering what was wrong with me. I felt fortunate to be crossing paths with such a dynamic, colorful, and charming character. And I decided right then and there that Edgar and I were going to be very good friends. Lucky for me, Edgar decided the same thing. A few years later, we began working on an issue that has already been mentioned, one that was a matter of justice. It was the spring of 1996. I was again at Edgar and Jan's home, and Edgar cornered me with an article he had torn out of a magazine about his work with the World Jewish Congress to recover assets that had been deposited in Swiss banks before the war and had never been accounted for, let alone returned. Edgar was convinced that one way he could push this cause forward was by getting the full force of the United States government behind him, and he wasn't shy about asking for it. He talked to me about it. I immediately said, well, of course, Bill would support you. I think it's something that we should do, we must do. And he said, fine, I want to see the president tomorrow. He was never shy about pressing a point or an issue, especially in the face of injustice. And the time to right this wrong was running out, he told me. So he did have a pretty good channel to the White House, and I picked up the phone and did call the president, and the next day, Edgar was in the Oval Office making his case to Bill. We knew even then it would not be an easy path forward, but we knew that it was the right thing to do. After all, more than a half-century had passed, and survivors and their families were no closer to getting back what was rightfully theirs. Bill and I both believed in Edgar and in the cause. He went to work with the same brilliance that had guided his family's company for decades, with the same doggedness that helped Jews in the Soviet Union shake free of oppression and reclaim their heritage, with the same commitment that took him around the world advancing religious freedom and tolerance. And in the years that followed, the United States Treasury Department carried out an exhaustive study on assets stolen by the Nazis, stolen from victims, and never, ever held accountable. Edgar was named chair of the Advisory Commission on Holocaust Assets, and in 1999, the World Jewish Congress obtained more than $1 billion in restitution from those banks for relatives of victims whose money had been stolen. That same year, as you have heard and seen, Bill proudly awarded Edgar with the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the highest honor that can be given to a civilian in our country. He did so for a life of remarkable citizen service. Edgar brought that same energy and drive to everything he touched during his remarkable life. His philanthropy helped break down barriers between nations and lift up the lives of so many young people. He exuded a confidence and honesty that won him the friendship and support of presidents, popes, and people everywhere. And in the moments when speaking honestly about challenging issues may have cost him some friends, he spoke honestly anyway. Because, as Edgar said, in forcing the world to face up to an ugly past, we help shape a more honorable future. Edgar did love Jeopardy. If the answer was Edgar M. Bronfman, then the question would have to go on for the rest of the show. Who was a successful businessman, a pioneering philanthropist, a loving family man, a champion for justice, a man of greatness who was also a great man? My family and I will miss Edgar. We will miss his friendship, his encouragement, even his occasional note about my wardrobe choices. I will miss his jokes. He leaves us a legacy and also a challenge. How will we fulfill the purpose of our lives? How will we help to change lives, to right wrongs, to repair the world? I think we will hear that challenge and those questions in our ears whenever we think about and smile about our memories of this extraordinary man. May God bless him.
Thank you, Secretary Clinton. I know that my dad died without any regrets, but I do know that he would have loved to live for a few more years to help you with whatever adventure it is you may go on. In the 1990s, Seagram was introducing a whiskey called Century, which was a blend of 100 different single malts from Scotland. As no product ever went out the door without Dad's approval, we conducted a tasting for him. At the tasting, Dad said, "One of the malts is sour. Go pull apart the blend and get it right." Incredibly, Dad was correct. One malt out of 99 others was indeed sour. And I tell you that story not to illustrate what an extraordinary palate Dad had, which he did, but to explain how exacting and precise he was. For him, products and principles were judged by the same standard. Was it right or not? Dad didn't equivocate. Once he set a course, that was the course he steered. He was always clear, always straightforward. You knew where he stood, and consequently, you knew where you stood with him. Dad enjoyed a very special and extremely unique freedom. Though he always wanted to listen, to learn, and to know what people thought, he didn't care at all what people thought of him. I never once saw Dad make a decision which included the calculus of how that decision might affect any other person's opinion of him. He did what he thought was right, period. And he lived the advice he always gave me. It's more important to be respected than to be liked. Dad was kind, and Dad was fierce. Fierce because before you got to the very genuine kindness, there was a rapier-sharp mind that had an abiding intolerance for fools and the unerring ability to recognize them. He was tough because it requires toughness to accomplish all he did as a diplomat, statesman, businessman, and deal with several wives, 7 children, 24 grandchildren, and 2 great-grandchildren. Truth be told, Dad's daughters gave him 3 grandchildren. Dad's sons gave him 21. Someone once asked Dad how he could possibly remember the names of all of his grandchildren, and he said, "Oh, I have no problem remembering their names. It's the names of the mothers I struggle with." Dad was a leader, Some people are, some are not. It's not about position or wealth. It's a force of personality, an intelligence that makes others willing, even eager to follow. Leadership requires bravery, and Dad was a brave man. He was also a passionate man, and passion is often in life the difference between being good and being superb. His passion for advancing the causes and values in which he believed was boundless. His passion for the people for whom he cared, for his company, and for civil rights for all was limitless. But his passion for power was more measured. Dad did not hunger for power as so many people do as an end in itself. He understood power, knew how to work its levers, but always did so to further his causes, his values, and for what he believed was the betterment and greater fellowship of mankind. As I mentioned, he didn't suffer fools and was intolerant of pointless conversation or silly, futile questions. Once in 1970, Dad was in the Soviet Union, and he was in a discussion with the then mayor of Moscow. And remarkably, the mayor of Moscow asked him, "Mr. Bronfman, how do you think the world would be different today had our comrade Khrushchev been assassinated and not your President Kennedy?" And my father replied, "Well, Mr. Onassis would not have married Mrs. Khrushchev." One comment I will remember all my days is the time when he and I were flying together, and the landing gear had malfunctioned such that we were going to have to attempt a crash landing. And so we were circling for a final approach. The runway was foamed. The fire trucks were lined up alongside the runway, and Dad asked for a Chivas and soda. I said to him, "Dad, how can you ask for a drink at a time like this?" And he said to me, "Son, if it's time for me to meet my maker, I don't think he'll recognize me without a drink in my hand." And though everything turned out all right that time, Dad's time on earth did finally come to an end. And having lost Dad, something that I've always said seems so much truer to me now. Your parents are not your parents until the day they die. Your parents are your parents until the day you die. And I'm fortunate because I get to carry Dad inside me for the rest of my life. So it's time for me to say thank you, Dad, for being a man of immense courage and integrity, for shining for all the world a path lit by your passion for life, your embrace of responsibility, your determination to make a difference, and your love of humanity in general and your family in particular. Thank you for the standards you set, for the principles you taught, for the support you showed, for the tolerance you granted, and for the unequivocal love you gave. I hope you can feel, Dad, in this room and in so many rooms watching this and in the far corners of the world, not only people's love for you, but the deep and enduring respect in which you will always be held. On behalf of Jan and the entire Bronfman family, I want to thank everyone for being here or from watching from wherever you are. You do us all a great honor. I love you, Dad. Always have. Always will.
Nachamu, Nachamu Yomar Elokechem. Nachamu, Nachamu Ami. Nachamu, Nachamu Yomar Elokechem. Dabru alev yechdu shalom. Ve'kiru de'techa dimalav zerata. Dimalav zerata. Nachamu, Nachamu, Ami. Nachamu, Nachamu, Yomar Elokechem. Kokoreh bamidbar, panu derech Hashem. Ya'ashu barama, Mesilah Elokeinu, Nachamu, Nachamu, Ami. Nachamu, Nachamu, Ami. Nachamu, Yomar Elokechem. Nachamu, Nachamu, Ami. Nachamu, Nachamu, Yomar Elokechem. Nachamu, Nachamu, Ami. Nachamu, Nachamu, Yomar Elokechem. Nachamu, Nachamu, Ami. Nachamu, Nachamu, Yomar Elokechem.
Thank you for joining in this extraordinary evening in celebration of the life of Edgar Bronfman. Please enable the family to exit first before we leave this hall. And if on your way out, you could please take the time to sign a memory card. It would be very meaningful for the family. I'd invite you to please rise and join us in this last song as we exit together, a melody that Edgar loved and that we began today together. This melody of separation, but a melody of connection at the same time. Yai, lai, la, 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 lai, lai, lai.